"You can wait downstairs with the delivery staff," the white executive said without even looking up from his phone. The words landed cold in the marble lobby, sharp enough to make the receptionist glance away in embarrassment. Elias Ward stood quietly beside the security desk, one hand resting on the handle of a worn black suitcase still dusted from LaGuardia rainwater. His dark charcoal coat carried faint creases from an overnight flight, and the silver coffee machine behind the front counter hissed softly into the silence that followed. 6:42 in the morning. The headquarters of Brooks and Mercer Global was already glowing with polished perfection. White stone floors reflected the pale light pouring through 40-foot glass windows. Men in tailored navy suits crossed the lobby with wireless earbuds and leather portfolios tucked beneath their arms. Women in heels moved quickly between elevators, balancing phones, coffees, and rehearsed smiles. Above them all hung the company's slogan in brushed steel letters, "Integrity First." Elias looked at it for a long moment without expression. Then he lowered his eyes toward the visitor badge clipped to his coat. Visitor. Temporary access. Nathaniel Brooks finally looked up from his phone and sighed impatiently. Tall, silver-haired, and dressed like a magazine cover for corporate wealth, he adjusted the cuffs of his tailored jacket before motioning lazily toward the seating area near the back wall. "You people always come in through the executive entrance like the rules don't apply to you." His tone stayed calm. Professional. Almost polite. That somehow made it worse. A few nearby employees lowered their heads immediately, pretending not to hear. Elias said nothing. That seemed to irritate Nathaniel more than an argument would have. "Security will verify whatever delivery you're here for," Nathaniel continued. "Until then, wait downstairs." Elias nodded once and walked toward the waiting area without protest. His shoes echoed softly against the marble floor. Near the elevators, two junior analysts exchanged uneasy glances. One opened his mouth like he wanted to say something, then stopped himself when Nathaniel walked past. The lobby smelled faintly of espresso, printer toner, and expensive cologne. Somewhere above them, a piano version of an old jazz standard drifted through hidden ceiling speakers. Elias sat in a gray leather chair beneath a massive abstract painting filled with harsh white and black strokes. He placed the suitcase beside his feet carefully, folded his hands together, and waited. A digital wall clock above reception ticked forward in glowing blue numbers. 6:44. Across the lobby, Nathaniel laughed quietly with another executive near the elevators. "Company culture matters," he said loudly enough for people nearby to hear. "Standards matter." Elias remained silent, watching reflections move across the polished floor like shadows beneath water. Then an elderly black janitor pushing a cleaning cart slowed beside him for half a second. She looked at the visitor badge clipped to his coat, then toward the executives laughing near the elevators. Her expression tightened slightly. "Don't let this place make you feel small, baby," she whispered gently before continuing down the hall. Elias watched her disappear around the corner just as the private executive elevator at the far end of the lobby gave a soft metallic ding. The soft metallic chime from the executive elevator barely lasted a second, but the effect rippled instantly across the lobby. Nathaniel stopped mid-sentence. The analysts near the reception desk straightened their posture. Even the receptionist quietly set down her coffee cup. The private elevator doors slid open with mechanical precision, revealing 3 members of the company board stepping into the marble light of the lobby. Arthur Holloway walked first, silver cane in hand, his dark overcoat hanging neatly over a tailored suit that probably cost more than most employees made in a month. Beside him came Evelyn Pierce, sharp-eyed and composed, carrying a thin black folder against her chest. The third board member, Daniel Mercer, loosened his scarf while glancing down at messages on his tablet. None of them appeared fully awake yet. Until Arthur looked across the lobby and froze completely. His hand tightened around the silver cane. Daniel stopped walking so suddenly that the tablet nearly slipped from his fingers. Evelyn blinked once, then lowered her folder slowly. The silence that followed felt different now. Heavy. Precise. Nathaniel noticed it immediately. Arthur, he said with a polished smile, stepping forward confidently. We were just preparing the executive floor for the 8 o'clock review. Arthur did not answer him. His eyes remained fixed on the man sitting quietly beneath the abstract painting near the waiting area. Elias looked up calmly from his chair. No smile. No irritation. Just stillness. For one strange second, the entire lobby seemed suspended inside that silence. Then Arthur spoke softly. Elias. Nathaniel frowned slightly. The receptionist looked confused. One of the junior analysts near the elevators quietly inhaled under his breath. Elias rose slowly from the leather chair, smoothing one hand along the front of his charcoal coat. Morning, Arthur, he said evenly. Daniel Mercer let out a nervous laugh that sounded almost accidental. Nobody told us you landed early. Evelyn's expression hardened as her eyes shifted toward the visitor badge clipped to Elias's coat. Then toward Nathaniel. She understood immediately. Nathaniel did not. Not yet. I apologize for the wait, sir, the receptionist blurted suddenly, color rushing into her face. Elias glanced at her gently. You have nothing to apologize for. But Nathaniel's confident posture had begun to crack around the edges. His eyes moved carefully between the board members and Elias, trying to force the pieces together before anyone else noticed he was behind. You know each other? He asked carefully. Arthur turned toward him slowly, disbelief settling across his face. Nathaniel, he said, almost quietly now. Do you seriously not recognize the founder of your own company? The word struck the lobby harder than any raised voice could have. The young analyst near the elevators immediately looked down at the floor. The receptionist covered her mouth softly with one hand. Somewhere across the marble lobby, a coffee cup slipped against a saucer with a faint ceramic click. Nathaniel stared at Elias as the color drained slowly from his face. The polished confidence he wore so naturally only minutes earlier suddenly looked fragile. Elias unclipped the visitor badge from his coat and placed it gently on the reception desk. The cheap plastic tapped softly against the marble surface. Interesting system you have here, he said calmly. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the hidden jazz music overhead now felt distant and thin beneath the pressure building quietly inside the room. Then Evelyn Pierce broke the silence. Boardroom, she said coldly while looking directly at Nathaniel. Now. The executive boardroom sat 38 floors above Manhattan, wrapped in floor-to-ceiling glass that overlooked the gray morning skyline like a throne above the city. Rain clouds still hung low over the Hudson River, muting the sunrise into pale silver streaks across the windows. Inside the room, the air smelled faintly of polished walnut, fresh espresso, and tension. Nobody touched the coffee waiting at each leather seat. Nathaniel Brooks stood near the far end of the conference table with his jaw tight and shoulders rigid, trying desperately to recover the confidence that had carried him through the lobby only minutes earlier. But every movement around him felt different now. Smaller. Colder. Elias Ward entered last. Calm. Unhurried. His black suitcase rolled softly across the dark hardwood floor before he stopped near the head of the table. Several executives immediately stood as he approached. Others followed awkwardly a second later after realizing they were the only ones still seated. Elias acknowledged none of it. He simply rested one hand against the chair at the head of the table and looked around the room slowly. The silence deepened under the weight of that gaze. Arthur Holloway removed his glasses carefully and rubbed the bridge of his nose. We should begin, he said quietly. Nathaniel cleared his throat. Mr. Ward, if there has been some misunderstanding this morning, I assure you it was never my intention to create discomfort. Elias finally looked at him directly. Discomfort? His voice stayed even, almost soft. Nathaniel swallowed once. I did not recognize you. Elias nodded slowly like he had expected that answer. That part became clear. No one moved. A digital screen on the far wall cycled silently through quarterly growth charts nobody was paying attention to anymore. Outside the glass windows, a helicopter drifted slowly over the river before disappearing into the low clouds. Evelyn Pierce opened the black folder in front of her. At 6:42 this morning, she said carefully, Mr. Ward entered the building through the executive lobby without advance notice. Nathaniel immediately straightened. Exactly. Without notice. Security protocol requires identification verification. Elias lowered himself into the chair at the head of the table at last. The leather creaked softly beneath him. Interesting, he said. Because I remember when this company had a policy that every employee entering the building would be greeted before being questioned. Nathaniel forced a polite smile that no longer reached his eyes. Times change. We have to maintain standards. Elias folded his hands together slowly. Standards. The word lingered in the room. Daniel Mercer shifted uneasily beside the window. Across the table, one executive quietly loosened his tie beneath the pressure building in the silence. Elias looked toward the city skyline for a moment before speaking again. Do you know why I built this company? Nobody answered immediately. Nathaniel finally spoke. To create opportunity. Elias turned back toward him. No. Opportunity is what people say in shareholder letters. His eyes moved across the room one face at a time. I built this place because my father spent 30 years cleaning office buildings where nobody learned his name. The room became still again. Every morning, Elias continued quietly, he entered through side doors while men half as intelligent walked past him like he was invisible. Nathaniel lowered his eyes briefly toward the polished table. Elias noticed. And this morning, he said, I watched that same culture walk proudly through a lobby with my company's name on the wall. The clock near the conference screen ticked softly. 7:03. 7:04. Nobody reached for coffee anymore. Then. Elias leaned back slightly in his chair and slid a slim black remote across the table toward Evelyn Pierce. Play the lobby footage. The massive conference screen flickered once before the security footage appeared across the wall in sharp black and white. Time stamp. 6:42 a.m. The executives watched themselves enter the lobby from different camera angles while rain streaked softly across the exterior glass outside. Nobody spoke. The only sound in the boardroom came from the low mechanical hum of the projector and the distant whisper of air conditioning moving through ceiling vents. Elias sat motionless at the head of the table while the footage rolled forward minute by minute. There he was stepping through the executive entrance with the black suitcase in one hand. Calm. Tired from travel. Quiet. Then the camera caught Nathaniel approaching from the elevator bank, coffee cup in hand, barely glancing up before speaking. You people always come in through the executive entrance like the rules do not apply to you. Hearing the sentence again inside the boardroom sounded different now. Colder. More naked. Nathaniel shifted uncomfortably beside the window. That was taken out of context, he muttered quickly. Elias did not even look at him. The footage continued. Executives walking past. Employees lowering their eyes. Security standing nearby without intervention. Then the screen showed the elderly janitor stopping beside Elias with her cleaning cart. Her lined face softened gently as she whispered something too quiet for the camera microphone to catch. Elias finally reached for the remote and paused the video frame there. The woman stood frozen on the screen beside her cart beneath the Silver Company slogan mounted on the lobby wall. Integrity first. Elias stared at the image for several long seconds before speaking. Do any of you know her name? Silence. Daniel Mercer slowly looked down at the table. Evelyn Pierce closed her folder softly. Nathaniel crossed his arms. I cannot possibly know every maintenance employee in a company this size. Elias nodded once. Her name is Lorraine Mitchell. His voice remained controlled, but something deeper now sat beneath the calm. She has worked in this building for 16 years. Nobody interrupted him. Every December, Elias continued quietly, she leaves handwritten holiday cards on the desks of employees before sunrise. Most people throw them away before noon. The words settled heavily into the room. Nathaniel looked irritated now more than ashamed, as if the entire conversation had become inconvenient. With respect, he said carefully, this company manages over 12,000 employees nationwide. We cannot operate on emotion. Elias finally turned toward him fully. Emotion? His eyes stayed steady on Nathaniel's face. No. This is not about emotion. He leaned forward slightly in the leather chair. It is about character. Outside the windows, a dull roll of thunder moved somewhere above the river. Gray morning light shifted softly across the polished conference table. Elias pressed play again. The footage resumed until the exact moment Nathaniel motioned Elias toward the waiting area near the back wall. The camera angle captured several young analysts watching nervously while pretending to work. One young black employee stood partially frozen near the reception desk, clearly uncomfortable but too afraid to intervene. Elias paused the screen again. That young analyst resigned 3 weeks ago, he said. Nathaniel frowned. What? Evelyn glanced toward her notes immediately. Elias continued. He wrote that this company rewards arrogance more than integrity. Nathaniel gave a quiet scoff. One disgruntled employee does not define corporate culture. Arthur Holloway finally looked up sharply from his seat. No, Nathaniel, he said in a tired voice. But patterns do. The room fell silent again. Elias slowly removed his watch and set it carefully on the walnut table beside him. The soft click echoed louder than it should have. 6 minutes, he said quietly. That is how long I sat in my own lobby before somebody treated me like a human being. Nobody in the boardroom could meet his eyes after that. The silence inside the boardroom stretched so long that the soft ticking of the wall clock began to sound unnaturally loud. 7:12. 7:13. Rain drifted steadily against the massive windows overlooking Manhattan, turning the skyline beyond the glass into blurred gray shadows. Nobody reached for their phones anymore. Nobody pretended to study quarterly reports. The atmosphere had shifted completely. What had begun as an uncomfortable misunderstanding now sat in the room like a verdict waiting to be spoken aloud. Nathaniel Brooks stood near the end of the conference table with both hands pressed against the polished walnut surface. His confident executive posture had begun to collapse beneath the weight pressing down around him from every direction. Still, pride kept him upright. I think we are losing perspective here, he said carefully, forcing calm back into his voice. This company has had record profits for 4 consecutive quarters. Employee retention is up nationally. Investor confidence has never been stronger. Elias Ward watched him quietly. And yet, Nathaniel continued, we are discussing a lobby interaction like it is some catastrophic failure. Arthur Holloway exhaled slowly through his nose. Evelyn Pierce looked openly disgusted now. But Nathaniel kept going, unable to stop himself. No offense intended, Elias, but walking into a corporate headquarters unannounced while dressed like, he stopped himself too late. The unfinished sentence hung in the room heavier than if he had completed it. Elias tilted his head slightly. Like what? Nathaniel swallowed. That is not what I meant. Elias leaned back slowly in the leather chair, studying him with a calmness that somehow made the pressure worse. No, he said softly. It is exactly what you meant. Outside, lightning flashed faintly inside the distant clouds above the river. The boardroom lights reflected across the table in long pale streaks beside untouched coffee cups and scattered financial reports. Daniel Mercer finally spoke for the first time in several minutes. Nathaniel, he said carefully, you should stop talking. But Nathaniel's composure had already begun unraveling under embarrassment and fear. I built this executive division, he snapped defensively. I doubled revenue in 3 years. I made difficult decisions this company needed. Elias nodded once. You certainly made your priorities clear this morning. Nathaniel laughed quietly, but there was no humor in it anymore. What was I supposed to do? Assume every stranger walking through the front entrance owns the building? Elias said nothing. That silence answered better than anger ever could. Nathaniel looked around the room desperately for support, but nobody met his eyes. Even the executives who used to laugh at his jokes now sat motionless behind glowing laptop screens and cooling espresso. Finally Nathaniel looked back toward Elias again. This is ridiculous, he muttered. One awkward interaction and suddenly my entire career is on trial. Elias folded his hands together. Your career is not on trial. His voice stayed low and controlled. Your character is. The words landed hard. Nathaniel stared at him without blinking. Elias reached toward the center of the table and picked up the slim employee report Evelyn had placed beside him earlier. He opened it slowly. Do you know how many discrimination complaints Human Resources buried under your division last year? Nathaniel's face tightened instantly. Evelyn answered before he could. 17. The room became still again. Do you know how many involved black employees? Elias asked quietly. Nathaniel did not answer. Arthur Holloway closed his eyes briefly like a man exhausted by disappointment. 11, Elias said. 11 people who felt invisible inside a company built by someone who promised they never would be. Nathaniel opened his mouth again, but this time no words came out. Elias slowly closed the report and placed it back onto the table with deliberate care. 6 minutes, he said softly again. That was all it took for me to see what this company is becoming under your leadership. The rain finally stopped around 7:28, but the clouds still pressed heavily against the windows of the executive boardroom, turning the morning light pale and colorless. Manhattan stretched below like a city holding its breath. Inside the room, nobody had moved for nearly a full minute after Elias spoke. The air itself seemed heavier now, dense with the kind of silence that only comes after truth settles into a place people spent years avoiding it. Nathaniel Brooks remained standing near the far end of the table, but the sharp executive confidence that once defined him had begun slipping away piece by piece. His tie sat slightly crooked now. One sleeve cuff had come undone without him noticing. Across from him, the board members looked older somehow. Tired. Evelyn Pierce slowly removed her reading glasses and placed them beside her folder with deliberate care. Daniel Mercer stared toward the rain-streaked skyline instead of the table. Arthur Holloway sat motionless with both hands resting over the silver handle of his cane. Elias remained calm at the head of the table. Quiet. Still. The untouched cup of black coffee near his hand had gone cold long ago. Steam no longer rose from it. He looked toward the windows for several seconds before speaking again. My father used to leave home at 4:30 every morning, he said softly. Nobody interrupted him. Brooklyn subway. Winter storms. Broken elevators. Did not matter. His voice stayed steady, but the room listened differently now. He cleaned office buildings downtown for 32 years. Elias lowered his eyes briefly toward the polished walnut table. Every Christmas he came home smelling like bleach and floor polish. The silence deepened around the words. And every year, Elias continued quietly, he told me the same thing. Nathaniel finally looked up again despite himself. Elias stared at the faint reflection of the skyline in the conference table surface. He said, son, watch how people treat the ones they think cannot fight back. That is who they really are. Nobody moved. Somewhere beyond the glass walls, thunder rolled softly over the river again, distant and low. Elias leaned back slowly in the leather chair. This morning, he said, I saw employees too afraid to speak. Analysts too nervous to make eye contact. A receptionist apologizing for something she did not even do. His eyes lifted toward Nathaniel at last. Fear spreads quietly inside a company. By the time executives notice it, the culture is already sick. Nathaniel swallowed hard. For the first time all morning, his voice lost its polished edge completely. I never intended for any of this. Elias nodded once. I believe that. Nathaniel blinked, surprised by the answer. Elias folded his hands together carefully. Most people do not wake up planning to become cruel. The room stayed still beneath the soft hum of the ceiling vents. It happens gradually, Elias continued. One ignored employee. One joke nobody challenges. One person treated differently because they look like they do not belong. Arthur Holloway closed his eyes briefly again. Daniel Mercer rubbed one hand slowly across his mouth like he suddenly felt ashamed to sit in the room at all. Elias looked toward the paused security footage still frozen across the giant conference screen. Lorraine Mitchell stood there beside her cleaning cart beneath the Silver Company slogan. Integrity first. She was the only person in that lobby who showed dignity before she knew who I was, Elias said quietly. Nathaniel lowered his head toward the floor at last. No defense now. No excuses. Just silence. Elias picked up the cold coffee cup slowly, stared at it for a second, then set it back down untouched. The faint ceramic sound echoed softly through the boardroom. That should trouble every person sitting at this table more than it troubles me, he said. 7:39 a.m. The storm clouds outside finally began to break apart above Manhattan, allowing thin bands of sunlight to slip across the river and scatter pale gold reflections through the massive boardroom windows. Dust floated slowly inside the beams of light above the conference table, soft and weightless against the tension still gripping the room. Nobody had touched the breakfast trays brought in earlier. Coffee sat cold. Pastries untouched. Half-open laptops glowed silently beside stacks of financial reports nobody cared about anymore. Elias Ward remained seated at the head of the table, calm as ever, while the executives around him looked increasingly exhausted beneath the pressure of their own silence. Nathaniel Brooks had not sat down once since the meeting began. He stood near the far wall now, arms folded tightly across his chest like a man trying to hold himself together from the outside. His face looked pale beneath the morning light. Across from him, Evelyn Pierce slowly reviewed a set of printed human resources complaints spread carefully across the walnut table. The pages looked heavier than paper should have looked. There is more, she said quietly. Nobody answered her immediately. Daniel Mercer rubbed tired eyes behind his glasses while Arthur Holloway stared silently toward the skyline. Evelyn lifted one document carefully. Senior analyst. Black female employee. Promoted twice without salary adjustment. Another page. Department coordinator. Complaint regarding discriminatory comments during leadership review. Another. Former intern. Reported feeling targeted after being mistaken repeatedly for building maintenance staff. Nathaniel exhaled sharply through his nose. Human Resources handles hundreds of complaints every year, he muttered defensively. That does not prove systemic discrimination. Elias finally looked toward him again. No, he said softly. Patterns prove it. Nathaniel opened his mouth, but Elias raised one hand gently before he could speak. Not aggressive. Not angry. Just enough to stop the room again. You know what troubles me most? Elias asked quietly. The executives remained still. None of these reports surprised anybody. The words settled heavily over the table. Evelyn slowly lowered the papers into her folder. Arthur Holloway leaned back in his chair with visible disappointment carved across his face. Elias rose from his seat for the first time in nearly an hour. The leather chair slid softly backward against the hardwood floor. Every eye in the room followed him immediately. He walked slowly toward the windows overlooking the city below. Sunlight reflected faintly across the dark glass beside his silhouette. "I built this company with 12 employees," he said quietly while staring out toward the skyline. "One office. Second-hand furniture. Leaking pipes every winter." A faint smile touched his face for half a second before disappearing again. "But people stayed because they felt respected." Nathaniel lowered his eyes toward the floor. Elias turned back. Slowly toward the room. "Now employees enter this building afraid to speak honestly to leadership." His voice remained controlled, but something about it cut deeper now because it never rose. "That is failure." Nobody argued. Nobody even shifted in their seats. The city beyond the glass windows glowed brighter as sunlight slowly overtook the storm clouds. Elias returned to the head of the table and rested both hands lightly against the chair in front of him. "Nathaniel Brooks," he said evenly, effective immediately, "your position as Chief Operating Officer is terminated." The words landed quietly. No shouting. No dramatic reaction. Somehow that made them heavier. Nathaniel blinked once like his brain needed extra time to process what had happened. Daniel Mercer looked away immediately. Evelyn closed her folder softly. Arthur Holloway simply nodded once, tired but unsurprised. Nathaniel swallowed hard. "After everything I built here?" he asked quietly. Elias held his gaze without anger. "You built profits," he replied. "But you damaged people while doing it." The room stayed silent. Then Elias reached for the cold coffee cup near his chair one final time and poured it slowly into the sink beside the conference bar. Dark liquid disappeared quietly down the drain while sunlight spread fully across the boardroom floor. Sunlight slowly spread across the boardroom floor after Nathaniel Brooks left the room, turning the rain-stained windows pale gold above Manhattan. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The silence felt heavier now that the argument was gone. Elias Ward remained standing beside the conference table with one hand resting lightly against the back of his chair while the city moved quietly beyond the glass walls. Evelyn Pierce closed the final personnel file and slid it across the polished walnut surface. "Human resources buried more complaints than we realized," she said softly. Arthur Holloway lowered his eyes toward the table. Daniel Mercer stared out at the skyline with visible shame across his face. Elias nodded once. "Fear survives when good people become comfortable around it." The words settled deeply into the room outside. Sunlight reflected across wet streets nearly 40 floors below. Elias walked slowly toward the giant conference screen where the frozen image of Lorraine Mitchell still remained beside her cleaning cart in the lobby. Footage. He studied the image quietly before speaking again. "She treated me with dignity before she knew who I was." Evelyn removed her glasses carefully. "Most people in this building forgot how to see each other." Elias folded his arms gently. "Then we remind them." Arthur finally looked up. "What happens now?" Elias glanced around the boardroom one face at a time. "Every unresolved complaint gets reopened. Executive reviews begin immediately and nobody enters this building through separate doors anymore." The room stayed silent beneath the warm morning light. Then Daniel Mercer gave a slow nod while Evelyn quietly smiled. For the first time all morning somewhere beyond the glass walls, thunder faded completely over the city. The building no longer felt untouchable, only human, standing quietly beneath the clean light of morning after rain. 8:26 in the morning. Sunlight poured through the towering glass walls of the corporate lobby, washing away the cold gray feeling that had filled the building only hours earlier. The marble floor reflected long golden streaks beneath moving feet while quiet conversations drifted softly through the air like people learning how to speak differently inside the same space. Elias Ward stepped out of the executive elevator with his black suitcase beside him. The wheels rolled gently across the polished floor, steady and calm. Employees noticed him immediately. Some straightened their posture. Others lowered their eyes with quiet embarrassment. But nobody looked away this time. Near the reception desk, the young receptionist stood slowly from her chair. Her hands trembled slightly against the counter edge before she finally spoke. "Mr. Ward?" Elias stopped beside the desk and turned toward her with the same calm expression he carried all morning. "Yes." The young woman hesitated for a moment while sunlight reflected across the silver letters mounted high behind her. "Integrity first." I should have treated you better before I knew who you were, she admitted softly. Elias studied her face for a second. Fear was still there, but something else had replaced part of it now. Honesty. The important part, Elias said gently, is learning to treat people with dignity before titles enter the room. The young receptionist nodded quietly, holding back emotion as he walked away. Across the lobby, Lorraine Mitchell pushed her cleaning cart slowly beside the windows overlooking Manhattan. Fresh sunlight illuminated the silver strands in her hair while the wheels of the cart whispered softly across the marble floor. She smiled the moment she saw Elias approaching. Building feels different already, she murmured. Elias glanced around the lobby. Employees now greeted maintenance workers by name. Analysts held doors open for reception staff. Small moments. Simple things. But real. Culture changes quietly, Elias replied. Lorraine adjusted the folded cleaning cloth resting over her cart handle. Your father used to say that respect is easy when everybody is watching. Elias smiled faintly at the memory. He also said character shows up in empty rooms. Lorraine laughed softly beneath her breath. For a second the tension of the entire morning finally loosened. Beyond the glass entrance doors, New York moved beneath warm sunlight and drying streets. Taxis rolled past steaming sidewalks while distant sirens blended into the endless rhythm of Manhattan waking fully into the day. Elias reached into his coat pocket and unfolded the old photograph of his father one last time. A janitor standing proudly outside a downtown office building beside his young son. No expensive suit. No corporate title. Just dignity. Elias stared at the photograph quietly while sunlight warmed the edges of the worn paper between his fingers. Then he folded it carefully and returned it to his pocket. Lorraine watched him gently. He would be proud of you today, she said. Elias looked toward the city outside before answering. I hope I made this place better than he found it. Lorraine smiled without needing another word. The lobby no longer felt cold. The fear that once lived quietly beneath polished floors and expensive suits had cracked open beneath. 6 minutes of truth. Elias rested one hand against the glass entrance door and paused briefly before stepping outside. Behind him, the sound of Lorraine's cleaning cart rolled softly through the golden morning light while employees moved through the building with quieter voices and open eyes. Then Elias walked into the bright Manhattan morning, disappearing into the city as the glass doors closed gently behind him and the lobby settled into peaceful silence.